Let's move actually on, but maybe back to Howard Terminal. And I realize even discussing this is awkward because the project as we know it entirely halted at this point. But at last check, Oakland had rounded up about $500 to $600 million through federal and state grants for infrastructure, not for the ballpark, but for everything around the site that needed improvements. The ballpark was set to be privately financed. There were supposed to be a bunch of tax benefits to the city, to the county. We're discussing, obviously, again, something that is currently dormant. But as you look back on that and knowing your take on public subsidies, was that going to be a different deal? Was that going to be actually a good deal from your viewpoint because of the way it was structured differently?
It was definitely different. Would it have been good for Oakland? I don't know. That's a sizable chunk of change to, put up for even for infrastructure, even if some of it, might benefit people who are not going to A's games. And you could argue, well, there's some benefit to having a new neighborhood developed there, and it would create new housing, and it would create,
Right.
but that's again, $600 million is a lot of money, even if it's coming from the state and the feds. So yeah, I mean, it's a little more justifiable, but it's still an awful lot to be putting up. And I think I'm slightly surprised that Fisher didn't look at it more seriously. From the sound of things, again, the way it's being talked about, there was some. He looked at it more favorably before COVID and the changes in the economy and
Sure.
changes in interest rates, right?
Right.
Where suddenly building a multi-billion-dollar development doesn't look as promising as it did back when interest rates were 2%. And he may have balked at that suddenly. And it's possible it doesn't work, right? But maybe that means you wait a few more years and wait until interest rates come down. Maybe it means you go back and look at the Coliseum site again, right?
Right.
Which he owns half of. And people have been talking about for years. Look, it's wide open. You can easily build a stadium in the parking lot, then tear down the Coliseum and build whatever you want on that portion of the parcel. There's lots of options still in Oakland, I think, and it sounds like the mayor is definitely open to talking if the team comes back. Yeah, the whole situation is really weird and really does drive home to me the degree to which we tend to think of billionaires as being these like savvy people who are looking at the bottom line and who are just trying to extract the best profit that they can, and they are on one level, but they're also human beings, right? And oftentimes it has more to do with ego or with I've said I'm doing this thing, I'm not going to back out of it now. You oftentimes wind up, I mean, this again could potentially be a lose, right? Where Fisher loses his shirt, Las Vegas loses, Nevada loses $600 million, and Oakland loses the team. And nobody comes out really looking very good. Very similar, honestly, to the Arizona Coyotes situation, right?
Right.
Where they moved out of Winnipeg years ago. And it was a disaster for everyone concerned. It's still now 20 years later, and the NHL still isn't backing away from no, we can make this work.
And they're playing on a college campus in a 5,000 seat arena called Mullet Arena, which I get it's from the family who paid for it, but it's still kind of funny with hockey, isn't it?
Yes.
And going back to Howard Terminal, just one thing that always kind of didn't sit well with me in reverse is it had to be a built-up thing. And I appreciate that they wanted to fill the entire 55 acres with development and fully flesh it out. I think that was ultimately the end game. But why couldn't the project start with just the ballpark and build it out? And you mentioned Oracle Park, formerly Pac Bell Park, when it was built. I mean, right now, 25, 30 years later, we're finally seeing the development around it. I'm just curious, to everybody's point about Howard Terminal, why it was too ambitious, but it might have been too ambitious in a sense of everything outside the stadium.
Yeah, my sense is that it was a kind of multi-step response to the fact that people in California, Oakland particularly, but like anywhere in the Bay Area, didn't want to put money into building a stadium, right?
Correct.
So it had to be, okay, if we're going to have to pay for the stadium, how can we get money somewhere else for something else? Well, we can get infrastructure money, but having new, underpasses and bus routes and things like that to get people to Howard Terminal for baseball games isn't going to make us rich. But if we can also use that to turn, what's a fairly inaccessible site into suddenly a place that's good for building a whole bunch of expensive housing, right? We can make money that way. And I think that is why you've got this thing where the stadium has always been coupled with the greater surrounding development. So once the other development falls through, suddenly it's like, well, you know, we're not going to make this money back just by selling A's tickets, right? Certainly not if the A's look like they have the last few years. So, I think it's kind of this, Rube Goldberg scheme, right? Where it's like you've got all these different pieces that have to go together, and if one domino falls, suddenly the whole thing falls apart.
If Howard Terminal never happens, is it looked back at a bad idea and that's why it didn't come together, or is it going to be looked at as a good idea that people never made happen?
I think both, depending on who, I mean, I think there's so much dispute over, people who think, no, that absolutely has to remain port versus people who are like, no, we absolutely need development. And this is a perfect opportunity for it.
Right.
And those are both legitimate points of view. And I think people will continue to debate it, whether or not anything gets built there. I mean, I live in Brooklyn where we have an enormous arena and development project for the Nets. And you can still get knocked down, drag out arguments today by asking two neighbors, was that a good thing or was that a bad thing?